Hello and welcome to Our American States, a podcast from the National Conference of State Legislatures. I'm your host, Ed Smith.
If we really want to get serious about work-based learning and apprenticeships, which I think is really a critical component to work-based learning, is how do we take a student and put them into an employer where they're actually being paid at the same time they're learning?
That was Representative Bob Behning, a Republican from Indiana and chair of the House Education Committee. He's one of my guests on this podcast, along with Maryland Senator Malcolm Augustine, a Democrat. Both have been deeply involved in legislation aimed at offering young people post-secondary opportunities other than college. College enrollment among young people has been in a steady decline, according to research from Pew. Indications are young people are increasingly turning toward apprenticeships and other work-based learning and credential programs that help them get a good job. Indiana and Maryland have been leaders in the field, and this was a great opportunity to talk with two legislators intimately involved in the issue. Representative Behning said participation in an NCSL study group helped inform legislation he's pursued to ensure more options for youth employment and to destigmatize technical education. He discussed Indiana's efforts to ensure all students have either a work-based learning experience or a leadership or community development opportunity. Senator Augustine explained the approach Maryland has taken to youth employment and the role of the Maryland Apprenticeship 2030 Commission in shaping future efforts. Here's our discussion, starting with Representative Behning. Representative Behning, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Now, you've been very involved in promoting work-based learning, apprenticeships, and helping youth get experience through work. In fact, one of my colleagues told me you're probably one of the top people in the country in terms of pursuing these policies in state legislature. And I wonder if you can talk about the current landscape of youth employment in Indiana and how this landscape has changed over the years that you've been working on it.
I would give you a little bit of history about how we got to where we are today and where we're going. I was involved with NCSL, was invited in 2012 to join the International Study Group. We were looking at best practices across the world. It was probably one of the most significant programs I've ever been in terms of a legislator, in terms of seeing what's going on in the rest of the world, how they take what we are doing right and apply it how we could take what they're doing. And really that's where I was initially exposed to the fact that career technical education in our country is looked at a thing that basically education leaders would say that's where they send kids who don't have the cognitive ability to be successful in a traditional program. So let's send them to a CTE center. Most of the rest of the world, especially a lot of our competitors, look at it totally differently. They look at CTE as a place to go for kids to do exploration and as a kind of a step up. It's not a dead end, and it's not someplace you push kids off to. So that was really a big reflection for me and a turning point. I actually came back from one of our international study groups meeting, have a friend who had been in the governor's office who had left the governor's office and now was at Richard M. Fairbanks Foundation, which is a foundation here in Indianapolis, and was sharing with her how profound I thought some of the things we were learning in the international study group was, and it piqued her interest. And she has actually been, and the Richard M. Fairbanks Foundation have been huge investors in studies in Indiana, which really has kind of facilitated and accelerated all of our interest. We started kind of down this pathway several years ago when we decided to eliminate we had a GQE, where a graduation qualifying exam we used to have to be that you had to pass either ISTEP 10 or an ECA. And we started to think a one-time test, does not necessarily determine what kind of currency you're going to have when you walk across the stage. I can't go to an employer and say, I'm Bob Behning and I just passed my ISTEP 10. I'm qualified to go into work. So we decided to redesign our what we call pathways now. And so we created a graduation pathways, and we have 9 different options for kids. And one of the requirements is a work-based learning. And it's a requirement for all kids to have a work-based learning or some sort of leadership development or community service component in it. So that's required for all of our students. The first class was a class of 23, but schools could opt in before that. We had a number of schools opt in before it. So it's been something that's been very well received. Initially, the establishment hated the program. They didn't like it at all because of some of the requirements in there. But today it's been embraced in a big way. If we really want to get serious about work-based learning and apprenticeships, which I think is really a critical component to work-based learning, is how do we take a student and put them into an employer where they're actually being paid at the same time they're learning. We have done a number of things where we've attempted to facilitate that, accelerate it. Well, last year we passed HCA 1002, which created career scholarship accounts, which are up to $5,000 given to students. It could be an apprenticeship. It could pay for tools, transportation, etc. And that started the process where we started diploma redesign. We accelerated it even more this year. I had a bill, House Enrolled Act 1243, where accelerated it even more. March 27th, our department released, I think probably the first in the nation, a diploma track that would actually embed work-based learning and give credit for students towards a diploma in a work-based learning experience.
Well, that is a huge amount of work. I'm surprised at how extensive it is. That's quite remarkable. Let me ask you, as part of that legislation last year, as I understand it, it requires students to explore their career options. And what does that mean exactly, and why is that so important?
We're not trying to be Switzerland. We understand Switzerland. As you look at models across the country, across the world, I would suggest that Switzerland there's a lot of things that are similar to the United States that are similar in Switzerland. I mean, that for us in Indiana, Switzerland's about the same size as the state of Indiana. Switzerland is not socialized at the level that a lot of Europe is. Switzerland actually in the Freedom Index is like third in the world, and the United States is like 17th. Tax structures are very similar. They don't have socialized medicine. There's a lot of comparability to Switzerland. So we're not necessarily trying to emulate Switzerland, but we have looked to them for a lot of guidance in terms of how to move this more quickly. And the thing that we found in Switzerland, for instance, if you're an eighth grader in Switzerland, you actually do a job shadowing where you spend 3 days, 2 to 3 days to a week, where you actually go to an employer and shadow an employer to see if this might be a work-based learning experience that you would like to apply for. We're trying to do more in Indiana to make sure that we're exposing kids earlier. I mean, waiting till they're in high school is way too late in many cases, especially when they're in, junior or senior, because we're looking at doing work-based learning experiences as juniors, seniors. We need to have these exploration opportunities much earlier, which is what we tried to do. And we'll continue. HEA 1002 from 23 was our first launch into it. We did a little bit, some tweaks this year. We'll continue to do some additional tweaks. There's some things in 1002 next year that I will be coming back and changing. One that's career exploration in post-secondary and the collegiate level. To me, it is at a junior year, which is too late. We need to push that down into like a freshman year, et cetera. Anyway, that was really the accelerant or the reason to kind of start looking at that more robustly. We've also had a process over the last several years too, where we're doing 3 E's, which are explore, engage, experience. So we have kind of embedded those into our philosophy for students moving forward. So they younger, they have the opportunity to explore. When they're in middle school, they can engage a little bit more, and then experiences when they have the opportunity to actually be an on-job experience. We're really pushing that in terms of career counseling, et cetera, and coaching. That we think that's a very important thing. We also, I will say, as a kind of interesting caveat on that too, we have kind of deliberately kept this out of the hands, since there's been a little bit of controversy over time or pushback, out of the hands of school counselors. We really want it to be more employer-based, because we believe that if we're going to be serious about work-based learning, they need to understand what's available in their community. A lot of times when you look at school counselors, no discredit to them. I mean, I actually employ a number of school counselors in my private sector role. They have been in K-12 system, most of them, their entire life, and not necessarily at all in the private sector. And we want to make sure we're kind of connecting students to the private sector in a more robust way.
Given all this, the career education, the work-based learning, the apprenticeships, how's this working out? What kind of effect have you seen, at least so far? I know it always takes a while for these things to show results.
Great question. I wish I could tell you that we figured it all out. Candidly, I think we are farther ahead than many states. In my private sector role, I feel like if I'm going to talk the talk, I need to walk the walk. And so I actually have an apprentice that works for me. One of the struggles I have had, and this is one of the things that we're trying to tweak through, is the fact that the student comes in at 3:15 and works till 5. And I work at a university. We're kind of a separate unit from the university, and we actually work with K-12 schools. So a lot of my staff comes in at 7 and leaves at 4. And so I don't have alignment with him. Plus, 2 hours a day is just, there's not enough continuity there. There's not enough time for somebody to really dig in and get something done. So one of the things that we know we have to fix, and we're working on with the diploma change, would be the fact that we need 2 full days a week to be given to a work-based learning experience. Not bits and pieces throughout the week, but ideally 2 full days. So we're working on that. In terms of where we are, as you said, it's a long process. Changing a system, the country embraced the Carnegie system, for instance, and looking at units. And when we're one of 4 states, I don't know if it's been announced yet, but we will be announced soon, that we'll be one of 4 states that they're going to be working with to rethink the Carnegie students and the Carnegie units. And actually our new diploma model that's been released and up for public comment right now moves away from Carnegie units. So you start moving away from seat time and look more at a mastery-based type of program. It's going to give us a lot more opportunity, I think, to accelerate this much faster.
Well, let me ask you about all the different areas. There is an awful lot of stuff that sort of falls under this umbrella, the work-based learning, earn while you learn, credentials program, so on and so forth. Can you talk about how Indiana has managed to juggle all these wide array of youth employment opportunities?
If I were suggesting to someone looking at trying to put this together, one of the things that we have done that is working effectively, if we move away from the opticals, is we've created in HEA 1002 what I would call intermediaries. We already had several of them in place. We have a group called Ascend Indiana. There's a group up north called Horizon Education Alliance. There's one in the south called ROI. They are in between the schools and employers. If you're going to be successful at this, you really need somebody that be kind of the glue between the two. Unfortunately, schools don't know what employers need, and employers really don't know what's going on in the schools. So having somebody in the middle has been very helpful. In Indianapolis, Marion County, for instance, the organization is called Employ Indy. And my apprentice that I have here was recruited through Employ Indy. That really is kind of the glue that you need to pull this together. And it's the one thing I think we need to do, make sure that every part of the state has an intermediary that will kind of help grow this a little bit more quickly. The lingo, for instance, educators use and the acronyms employers use, it's kind of like putting 2 people, almost people that don't even speak the same language in a room and asking them to come together. So without this intermediaries, it's very difficult. One of the examples I can give you, I had at Ascend, they had a healthcare provider up in the Lafayette area had reached out and they said one of the schools was trying to get a work-based learning experience and they wanted to create a physical therapy pathway. The reality is the hospital's like, we don't need physical therapists. We need LPNs, RNs, and they wanted $250,000 to do the program. And Arnett Health Systems was like, do we just give them the money to get them out of the room and so we can go on with our business? Or how do we get that discussion where we can sit down and say, we don't need physical therapists. We need programs like LPNs, RNs, medical assistants, things like that for our system. And having a intermediary in there, it helps facilitate that.
I've talked to people over the years doing this podcast about other apprenticeship programs and that kind of thing. And sometimes people bring up that some groups of young people, whether because they're Black, brown, disabled, don't get quite as much opportunity, they're not as well represented. One, I wonder if you find that that's true. And if so, are there efforts in Indiana to try to make sure that everybody's getting pulled into this net?
Statistically, I mean, you can't argue the facts. Statistically, you look at the numbers, that's true. because it's a requirement in Indiana, it's a little bit different. And I've been very emphatic with anybody I talk about. It's not for those kids, it's for all kids. And I think you have to make sure that we talk about this is good for every kid. I was talking to an education leader the other day where we're going to create a pathway for teachers where we will do, they'll do cadet teaching. At the same time, we're going to pay them to be teachers' aides. They're going to be dual credit or dual enrollment. They can use CSAs to help pay for that. One of the other things, the barriers I think that a lot of kids of poverty, minorities have is transportation. The one thing that we don't have in common with the Swiss system is the robust transportation system, public transportation system they have. So we do allow with the CSA dollars to be used for transportation. And I think that's going to be critical. We've done some other things this year where we allowed our traditional public schools to use their transportation dollars for purposes of work-based learning to get kids back and forth. So, but we're very deliberate in making sure that this is not those kids or whatever. And I mean, the reverse to that could be that, in fact, in Employee Indy, they actually have a much higher number of minority students than white. And they're frequently saying, well, hey, look at this number. I'm like, let's be careful about this. We want to make sure that this is, like I said, for all kids. I don't want the perception, and I want to make sure it's a quality option for every kid. One of the other things that's going to be critical to the system, one of the other groups in iLab, which I excluded earlier, was the higher ed group, because one of the other critical mix to the whole thing is making sure that these students who choose to go through apprenticeship have options beyond the apprenticeship. So they would actually complete the apprenticeship. Almost all the time, it's going to be post high school graduation. I mean, like with Employee Indy, I'm required to provide so many credit hours of post-secondary training. Working for a university, that's easy, but making sure that those things are accomplished. And the other thing that we're looking at creating is what the Swiss call a professional education training system. So it's a parallel system to the baccalaureate system. So you could, for instance, in Switzerland and in some of our countries, some of our states in actually the United States still have this available, at least at some level. You could serve as an apprentice, for instance, and want to go into accounting. And you could work in a business for 4 or 5 years, work in the accounting office, do all sorts of different master competencies. You can sit for the CPA exam and become a CPA, or you can go the baccalaureate track and do the same thing and do it all be book learning. You don't have any of the work-based learning, but you can get a CPA. Another great example of that would be an attorney. An attorney could, and there's a couple of states who actually allow for you to do a work-based learning where you accrue a lot of the competencies to be an attorney. You take state bar, and you can be the same as someone who had gone through law school. The one complexity that we have to solve is how do we make sure that there's crosswalks across the systems, so that if I am this accountant who did a work-based learning experience and I have the equivalency of what would be considered a bachelor's degree, and now I want to go on and get an MBA, how do I make sure that I get that recognition and can go back and forth in the system so that I could go into the baccalaureate system and, for instance, and get an MBA if I choose to, or the baccalaureate system can come into the professional system.
As we get ready to wrap up, the question I always like to ask legislators is, what advice would you give to your colleagues around the country if they want to get involved in this policy area? Where should they start?
Well, I think the one thing that has been helpful to me, and I think a lot of people would agree with this, is seeing it in practice. Having somebody talk about it, like on a podcast or even at a conference, it's a lot different than seeing it on the ground. I've been to Switzerland numerous times now because of where we are. And I will tell you, every time I go with a different group, I said, you need to go when you're out into the public, just talk to some of the young people. I mean, they're very open in general, and ask them what their experience has been, because I truly believe seeing it will change your mind. With the 120 people we took over in September, it has been like a revival experience to a lot of people. Like, wow, we never thought this was possible. This gives kids the opportunity to experience something that they may find very attractive, but it may be something, this is not what I want to spend my rest of life doing. And we need to make sure we design something that dozen dead end kids. But I think having that opportunity to really see it in person is great.
Representative, thanks so much. Really a lot of food for thought here, and I appreciate you taking the time. Take care.
No problem. Thank you.
I'll be right back after this short break with Senator Augustine.
It's the most exciting 3 days in politics and public policy. If you're one of the nation's 7,386 state legislators, then you need to plan on meeting with your colleagues at the National Conference of State Legislatures 2024 Legislative Summit. It takes place August 5th through the 7th. Set against the backdrop of Louisville's rich equestrian heritage, the summit is the nation's largest bipartisan gathering of state legislators. And you won't find a better menu of sessions on the topics you care about the most. A series of sessions at the meeting will focus on one of the most complex issues facing lawmakers today, artificial intelligence. And of course, we'll cover everything else, from education to healthcare and elections to the workforce. Join your colleagues from across the country to connect, collaborate, and share best practices for how to resolve the state's most pressing policy issues. And represent your state to vote on state-federal issues at the annual business meeting. Registration is now open at ncsl.org/summit. Reserve your spot today.
Senator Augustine, welcome to the podcast.
Good morning. Thank you.
You've been a champion of work-based learning, apprenticeships, getting youth to get some experience through work. And I wonder if you can talk about the current landscape of youth employment in Maryland and how that's changed over the years.
Absolutely. Thank you. Employers are hiring and they really need workers. We have some of the lowest unemployment rate here in the country here in Maryland. We got really great jobs that need to be filled, and we just need to match the jobs with the Marylanders, our young Marylanders who want those careers, and we have them. They're available. That is a task that we have taken to be, just front of mind and central for us as we look at the future for youth employment in our state.
So can you talk a little bit about what Maryland has done to connect youth to job training, some of the specific things that have gone on there?
Absolutely. We have an extensive network. We've had it for many years of connecting our youth to job opportunities. We have a Maryland Apprenticeship and Training Program that's housed inside of our Department of Labor, where we have the registered apprenticeships, and which of course we know they're really good for business. But there is also a focus and a focus group that looks specifically at youth apprenticeships as a lever towards good careers that sits within that group. And we have sort of like this overarching council here in the state of Maryland, the Maryland Apprenticeship and Training Council, that is really focused. One of the things that it focuses on is trying to make sure that we are moving youth into the apprenticeship opportunities that are in our state.
Youth employment encompasses a lot of different areas: work-based learning, apprenticeship, earn while you learn, credential programs, that kind of thing. How do you support that wide an array of opportunities in Maryland?
Well, obviously that it's a significant cross section, and we here in Maryland wanted to be thoughtful about it. And so last year, I sponsored legislation that created a Maryland Apprenticeship 2030 Commission. And that Maryland 2030 Apprenticeship Commission, its job is to really make sure that we bring those things that you just talked about together, try to accommodate the actual skill shortages that we have for our high demand occupations, and then also to provide this affordable training for career pathways for young people in both the public and the private sector. And we have some specific goals that we put into this as well, to expand our registered apprenticeships and to grow the number of registered apprentices to at least 60,000 by 2030. It's a very important goal. We also have a blueprint for Maryland's future, which has to do with our school system. And within that, there's a 45% goal of our high school graduates are completing the high school level, basically of a registered apprentice within the career and technical education space. We have tried to really have this group focused on bringing all those things together that you mentioned.
So those are the goals. What do you see right now as the progress you're making toward those? Are you on track?
As you said, it is a significant matrix. We've been meeting. We've brought together the different stakeholders. We have an interim report with some recommendations that really look at how we might be able to streamline some of the regulations that were in some ways creating certain barriers with regard to our apprenticeship programs, particularly our registered apprenticeship programs. We also look within the stakeholder groups to see novel areas that right now are not within the registered apprenticeship space, but that might be able to fit. And so by bringing together these diverse stakeholders, this is our task that we're now looking at going forward is in the next year is to look at just that. We also think that we have a job to sell apprenticeship as well to our employers, that this is something that can work for them, because for some, they have not done this as we look into other areas that some folks would not necessarily consider for apprenticeship.
Yeah, I know that in Europe, it's a much more and longer standing practice. So it's a sort of a cultural change, if you will, as well, I guess, for employers here. Speaking of that, government, of course, is one piece of this. That's always the case. But any situation like this, there's also working with employers, other stakeholders in the space. And what kind of success have you had there in Maryland with that group?
Well, again, that's where I'm saying like that's been one of the central pieces of our commission, is to ensure that the roster of the folks who were there represent different stakeholder groups and industries that you wouldn't necessarily expect. So yes, of course, we'll have labor there who have had historically fantastic, great career supporting jobs and apprenticeship pathways for students. But that we also then have representatives from some of the industries that are here in Maryland. So information technology, which is central is an opportunity space for us in Maryland. Cyber, and within that, of course, cyber is very, very important to us. And we know that there are certain opportunities that are there that can work. And we also have a significant biomedical area and space here in Maryland. And so we've engaged with these different groups that are in other parts of the world. They do have these pathways that are in the apprentice space, and we're trying to see how we might be able to make that work here. So we've really worked hard to engage directly with those folks. I think it's also similarly important. We also are engaging with the young kids themselves on what is it that they want to do and how do they want to make this thing work for them. I think that it's important that we talk to all of the folks in order to make this shift, because it will require a shift. The earn to learn right now it's in a specific space, but we want to really expand that space. And so that does require some work on our part.
Some youth, Black youth, brown youth, disabled, are often underrepresented in these programs. And what kind of effort have you made there in Maryland to try to make sure that those kids are all getting pulled into this as well?
We have been absolutely deliberate in making sure that we open the doors and that we are inclusive to all Marylanders, particularly our boards and our commissions who are making decisions and recommendations that become a part of our policy decisions, that they reflect the population of our state, which has a significant population of Black and brown folks and those who are living with disabilities. So by making sure that these groups have a seat at the table, so their perspective is brought to these conversations, their lived experience is a part of it, that's how we are trying our very best to make sure that these programs will meet the needs of all Marylanders.
As we get ready to wrap up, I always like to ask legislators what they'd share with their colleagues around the country. One of the goals of NCSL to be able to try to share information. And I wonder what you would say to other folks in our audience who might be interested in getting involved in this policy area.
I would say that this is a space that has tremendous, tremendous potential, and it's a forward-looking space. This is one of those things where I find that this is an opportunity where we can have a policy, we can have a policy decision, and we can have investments that are going to really pay off in the long term. But we just need to work on it sooner so that this will allow for people to really live out to their full potential. I think it's very important, though, that when we try to do these things, we've got to listen to all the stakeholders in this process. In this instance, we're talking about the businesses who have these opportunities. It's the youth who can fill those opportunities, and the government and the associated entities and nonprofits that can fill that gap in between and be able to provide that space to allow to connect or to help with the connection that is there. I think that if by doing those things, it can be very, very rewarding, and it can lead to really us boosting and filling some of these opportunities that are there that I think that people really could appreciate and could really live a full, career that really is a rewarding way that we're looking for Marylanders.
Well, Senator, thanks so much for taking the time to walk us through this. It's such an incredibly important area that I'm glad we're able to have our listeners hear your perspective on it. Take care.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to get to talk to you.
I've been talking with Representative Bob Behning of Indiana and Senator Malcolm Augustine of Maryland about efforts in their states to create more opportunities for youth employment. Thanks for listening. You can check out all of the podcasts from the National Conference of State Legislatures by searching for NCSL Podcasts wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast, Our American States, dives into some of the most challenging public policy issues facing legislators today. On Across the Aisle, host Kelly Griffin tells stories of bipartisanship. Also, check out our special series, Building Democracy, on the history of legislatures.